The chandeliers of Lady Pemberton's ballroom cast their golden light upon silk and jewels, upon powdered faces and practised smiles, upon all the glittering artifice of London society in the spring of 1817. Yet that warm glow could not penetrate the circle of cold that surrounded Lady Helena Ashford, where she stood near the potted palms at the room's edge. The whispers moved through the assembled company, like wind through autumn leaves, a susurration of malice and speculation that followed her every movement, every breath, every desperate attempt to maintain the composure that was all she had left. She heard the words clearly enough, though they were spoken behind fans and gloved hands. Thief, disgrace, how dare she show her face? The Blackwood heirloom, such betrayal, always knew there was something not quite right about her. The words cut deeper than any blade, each one a fresh wound upon her already bleeding reputation, and she held her head high against their assault, her spine straight despite the trembling in her hands, the burning behind her eyes that she would not, could not allow to manifest as tears. Across the ballroom, through the swirling dancers and the clusters of gossips, the Earl of Ravenscroft watched her with eyes like winter frost, Julian Blackwood in all his dark magnificence, his expression carved from stone and satisfaction. He stood among his own circle of admirers and sycophants, a glass of wine held negligently in one hand, and Helena knew with the certainty of bitter experience that he was the source of the poison that had destroyed her, that he had spent these past months ensuring that every drawing-room in London knew of her alleged theft of his family's priceless emerald necklace, a Renaissance piece that had belonged to the Blackwoods for generations. She had protested her innocence until her voice grew hoarse, had begged him to believe her, to investigate further, to see reason. But he had looked at her with those cold, merciless eyes and pronounced her guilty, and his word, the word of an earl, a man of unimpeachable reputation and ancient lineage, had been enough to condemn her utterly. Now she existed in this half-world of social death, invited to events only because her own title prevented complete exclusion, yet shunned by all who valued their own reputations, forced to stand alone while others danced and laughed and lived their lives untouched by the scandal that had become her entire existence. She could feel his gaze upon her like a physical weight, could sense his triumph in the set of his shoulders, the slight curve of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and something inside her chest constricted with a pain that went beyond humiliation, beyond anger, into some deeper territory of loss that she had no name for. The music swelled, couples swept past in their elaborate patterns, and Lady Helena Ashford stood isolated in the midst of society's splendour, her dove-grey gown a ghost among the jewel tones, her future reduced to ashes by the vengeance of a man who had once called her friend. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. 6 months had passed since that terrible evening at Lady Pemberton's ball, 6 months that had transformed Helena's life from one of modest comfort to genteel poverty, her small inheritance from her parents barely sufficient to maintain the tiny lodgings in an unfashionable quarter of London where she now resided, where the wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the fireplace smoked, and the sounds of the street vendors rose through her single window at all hours. She had dismissed her maid, reduced her wardrobe to the barest essentials, learned to mend her own stockings and press her own gowns, and still the creditors circled like vultures, still the bills accumulated on her writing desk. Still she watched her meagre funds dwindle week by week towards some inevitable collapse she could not prevent. The invitations had ceased entirely now, society having moved from scandalized fascination to complete dismissal, and Helena found herself existing in a strange limbo, where she retained her title, but had lost all the privileges that should have accompanied it, neither fully cast out nor welcomed back, simply forgotten by a world that had once been her entire universe. It was on a grey October morning, rain streaking her window and the coal scuttle nearly empty, that the letter arrived bearing the Ravenscroft seal, and her hands trembled as she broke the wax, her heart pounding with some mixture of dread and impossible hope that perhaps he had discovered his error, perhaps he meant to apologize, perhaps this nightmare might finally end. But the contents of the letter drove all such foolish wishes from her mind, for the Earl of Ravenscroft wrote not of emeralds or accusations, but of his sister, of Lady Caroline, who had fallen gravely ill with a fever that would not break, who refused the ministrations of physicians and the comfort of nurses, who had spoken only one coherent request in her delirium. She wanted Helena, needed Helena, would accept help from no one else. The letter was brief, the handwriting harsh and angular, as though each word cost him dearly, and Julian Blackwood proposed an arrangement with all the warmth of a business contract. Helena would come to Ravenscroft Manor, would tend to his sister until the crisis passed, and in exchange he would settle her debts and provide a quarterly allowance sufficient to restore her independence, no further obligation between them once Caroline recovered. Helena read the letter 3 times, her emotions a chaos of anger and longing and grief. For Caroline had been like a sister to her once, the bright-eyed girl of 16, who had followed her through the gardens and confided her dreams and begged Helena to stay forever at Ravenscroft. And the thought of that sweet child suffering, calling for her, broke through all the walls Helena had built around her wounded heart. She did not want Julian's money, did not want his cold charity or his contempt. But Caroline she could not abandon. Caroline she still loved, despite everything that had passed between their families. And so Helena took up her pen with shaking fingers and wrote her acceptance, knowing she was walking back into the house of her enemy, into the presence of the man who had destroyed her, for the sake of a girl who perhaps alone in all the world still believed in her innocence. The carriage turned through the iron gates of Ravenscroft Manor on a late October afternoon, when the sky hung low and grey above the Derbyshire countryside, and Helena felt her breath catch in her throat at the sight of the estate rising before her like something from a Gothic tale, all grey stone and towering chimneys and windows that gleamed darkly in the fading light, ivy climbing the western wall in crimson glory, while the ancient oaks that lined the drive had begun to shed their leaves in drifts of gold and amber across the carefully tended grounds. She had travelled 2 days to reach this place, her single trunk secured to the back of the hired coach, and every mile had brought fresh memories rising like ghosts to haunt her. The first time she had come here as a guest of the late Countess, how welcomed she had felt, how the warmth of the Blackwood family had seemed to promise an end to the loneliness that had defined her existence since her parents' deaths, how foolish she had been to believe she could ever truly belong anywhere. The carriage halted before the main entrance, and Helena descended without waiting for assistance, her worn travelling cloak whipping around her in the wind that had risen with the approaching evening, carrying with it the scent of rain and wood smoke, and the particular melancholy of autumn in the country. The door opened before she could approach, and there he stood framed in the entrance, the Earl of Ravenscroft himself rather than any servant, and Helena felt her spine straighten instinctively against the impact of his presence, Julian Blackwood in his dark coat and severe expression, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that held neither welcome nor warmth, but something harder, colder, a barely concealed contempt that radiated from him like frost. Their first exchange was brief, formal to the point of pain, his greeting delivered in clipped tones that conveyed his displeasure at this necessity, his resentment at being forced to invite her into his home, and Helena responded with quiet dignity that cost her more than he could know, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands. Her composure maintained through sheer force of will as he informed her that Caroline was asking for her, that the physician had just left, that she would be shown to the rooms prepared for her in the east wing. A housekeeper appeared, Mrs. Davidson, who had once smiled at Helena with genuine affection, but now maintained a careful neutrality, and Helena followed her through the familiar corridors, where portraits of Blackwood ancestors gazed down with painted eyes, through halls she had once traversed with Caroline's laughter ringing in her ears, up the grand staircase with its carved balustrade that she had descended countless times in happier days, until they reached a suite of rooms that had been prepared with adequate comfort, but none of the warmth that had characterized her previous visits. The fires lit, but the flowers absent. The furnishings sufficient but impersonal, and Helena understood that she was here as hired help rather than guest, as a necessary evil rather than a welcomed friend, and the weight of that understanding, of returning to a place where she had once been cherished, only to find herself merely tolerated, pressed upon her chest like a stone until she could barely draw breath. Mrs. Davidson led Helena through the corridor to Caroline's chambers, and with each step Helena's heart beat faster in her chest, a mixture of dread and desperate hope coursing through her veins, for she had not seen the girl in 6 months, had not known whether Caroline believed the terrible things said about her, or whether some thread of their former affection might yet remain. And when the housekeeper pushed open the door to reveal the darkened room with its heavy curtains drawn against the fading daylight, the air thick with the scent of illness and lavender water, Helena saw her and felt her breath catch painfully in her throat. Caroline lay against a mountain of pillows, her face pale as parchment and far too thin, her once lustrous dark hair lank against her shoulders, and she looked so fragile, so diminished from the vibrant girl who had danced through these halls just months ago, that Helena felt tears prick her eyes even as she moved forward on instinct, years of separation and scandal falling away in the face of Caroline's obvious suffering. The girl's eyes fluttered open at the sound of footsteps, unfocused at first from fever. But when her gaze settled on Helena's face, something broke in her expression, and she began to weep, great shaking sobs that racked her weakened frame, her thin arms reaching out with desperate need, and Helena rushed to the bedside, gathering Caroline against her chest as the girl clutched at her worn travelling dress with trembling fingers and whispered her name over and over like a prayer, like an absolution, like the only word that mattered in all the world. Helena stroked Caroline's hair and murmured soft reassurances, rocking her gently as one might comfort a child, and she did not hear Julian enter the room behind her, did not know he stood in the doorway watching this reunion, with an expression of such conflict that Mrs. Davidson looked away in discomfort, for the Earl's face showed everything he fought to conceal, the shock at his sister's passionate response to the woman he believed had betrayed them, the confusion at witnessing such genuine love between them, the first hairline cracks forming in the certainty he had carried for 6 months, like armor against doubt. Helena settled onto the chair beside Caroline's bed, never releasing the girl's hand, even as the weeping subsided into exhausted hiccups, and she began to speak in low, soothing tones about nothing and everything, about the journey from London and the beauty of the autumn countryside, and the novels she had been reading. Ordinary conversation that seemed to calm Caroline's agitation in a way the physician's sedatives had failed to do, and gradually the girl's breathing steadied, and colour began to return to her ashen cheeks. Julian remained in the doorway, unable to move or speak, watching Helena wipe Caroline's tears with her own handkerchief, watching her pour water from the bedside pitcher with practised care, watching her adjust the pillows with a tenderness that spoke of genuine devotion, and he felt something shift in his chest, some stone he had placed there beginning to crack under the weight of what he witnessed. As evening fell and the servants brought candles, Helena did not leave her post, and when Caroline asked her in a voice barely above a whisper to read aloud, Helena took up the volume of poetry from the bedside table and began to recite verses in her clear, gentle voice, and Julian found himself leaning against the doorframe, listening to words about love and loss and redemption, while shadows danced on the walls, and his sister's hand remained clasped in Helena's as though she were clutching the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Through the long night hours, Helena kept her vigil beside Caroline's bed, and as fever rose and fell like tides, the girl's mumblings brought fragments of the past rising to the surface, half-formed memories tumbling from her lips in disconnected pieces that gradually assembled themselves into a portrait of what had been lost. And Helena found herself remembering too, despite her best efforts to keep such memories locked away where they could not wound her. Caroline spoke of riding lessons in the summer, when Helena had first come to stay, how patient she had been teaching a girl of 12 to sit properly in the saddle, how they had laughed until they could barely breathe when Caroline's mare had stopped dead at a puddle and refused to budge, and Helena pressed her cool cloth against Caroline's burning forehead and whispered, "Yes, yes," she remembered the sun on their faces, and the wind in their hair, and the extraordinary feeling of belonging somewhere, to someone, of being needed rather than merely tolerated. The girl's fevered words painted pictures of Christmas celebrations and birthdays, of Helena helping her dress for her first ball, of secret confidences shared in the garden and hopes whispered in the darkness, and with each memory Helena felt the old grief rising fresh in her chest, the loss of this connection cutting deeper than any scandal, for Caroline had been the sister she never had, the family her orphaned heart had craved with desperate longing. Julian stood in the shadows beyond the candlelight, unable to leave despite telling himself he had no reason to stay, and he heard these memories too, heard his sister speak of Helena as though she were the sun around which Caroline's world had revolved. And against his will, he found himself remembering as well the sound of Helena's laughter echoing through these halls, how his mother's face had lit up whenever Helena entered a room, how the manor had seemed warmer somehow when she was in residence, filled with a lightness that had departed with her disgrace and never returned. He remembered Helena at the pianoforte, playing duets with Caroline while his mother looked on with such profound contentment. Helena in the library debating literature with an intelligence that had both challenged and delighted him. Helena at dinner with candlelight catching in her auburn hair and turning it to flame. And he remembered too how his mother had taken his hand one evening and suggested with gentle hope that Helena might make an excellent addition to their family, that she had all the qualities one could wish for in a daughter-in-law, and he had been irritated at such matchmaking then, 24, and arrogant, and convinced he had years before he need concern himself with such matters. Now he stood in his sister's darkened room, listening to Caroline's fevered recollections of Helena's kindness, Helena's patience, Helena's unwavering devotion, and he felt the contrast between the warmth of those memories and the ice of his current treatment of her like a blade between his ribs, felt the wrongness of it settling in his bones, even as he tried to push the feeling away, for he had been so certain of her guilt, so absolutely convinced that she had stolen the Blackwood sapphire, and yet here sat the woman he had destroyed, tending his sister through the night with tenderness that could not be feigned, sacrificing her own rest and comfort without complaint or expectation of gratitude, and the certainty he had nursed for 6 months began to feel less like bedrock and more like sand shifting beneath his feet. The library at Ravencroft Manor stood in the oldest wing of the house, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes accumulated over generations, and it was there that Julian found himself wandering near midnight, 3 days after Helena's arrival, sleep eluding him as it had done increasingly since she had come back into his home, bringing with her memories he had tried to bury beneath anger and certainty. He pushed open the heavy oak door, expecting to find the room dark and empty, but instead candlelight flickered from the far corner where the medical texts were shelved, and there sat Helena at his mother's old writing desk, surrounded by open books, her auburn hair falling loose from its pins, and her face pale with exhaustion in the golden light, and she was so absorbed in her reading that she did not hear him enter. Julian stood in the doorway watching her turn pages with quick, desperate movements, pausing to make notes on a scrap of paper, her lips moving silently as she read passages about fevers and their treatments, about what might be done when physicians had failed. And he saw in the set of her shoulders and the shadows beneath her eyes a devotion that went far beyond duty or even the terms of their arrangement, saw evidence of sleepless nights and worry that had carved new hollows in her cheeks. She looked up suddenly, as though sensing his presence, and wariness immediately shuttered her expression, her hand moving to gather her notes as if he might object to her presence here. But Julian found himself saying with uncharacteristic gentleness that she need not leave, that she had as much right to the library as anyone, perhaps more given that his mother had always said it was Helena's favourite room in the house, and the words seemed to surprise them both. Helena settled back into her chair but kept her guard raised, and for a long moment they existed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of rain beginning to fall against the windows, until Julian asked how Caroline fared and whether the fever had broken, and Helena answered that it had lowered slightly, but not enough, that she was searching for some treatment the physician might have overlooked, some combination of remedies that might bring relief where conventional methods had failed. They spoke then of Caroline's condition with a civility that felt strange after days of cold formality, and Julian found himself drawn closer to the desk, looking at the texts Helena had consulted, at her careful notes written in a hand he remembered from letters she had once sent to his mother, and he saw the thoroughness of her research, the desperate hope underlying every word she had written. He noticed too the worn fabric of her dress, mended carefully at the cuffs, the absence of jewellery save for a simple locket that had belonged to her mother, the signs of reduced circumstances that spoke of how far she had fallen, while he had carried on with his title and his wealth and his righteous anger. And something shifted in his chest, some small crack forming in the wall he had built around his certainty. Helena looked up at him with eyes that held no hope of kindness, only resignation to his continued contempt, and the absence of expectation in her gaze wounded him in ways he could not name, for he realized that she had grown accustomed to his cruelty, had learned to expect nothing from him but coldness, and the thought that he had brought her to this state settled on him like a stone, heavy and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. And when he suggested quietly that she should rest, that she could do Caroline no good if she collapsed from exhaustion, Helena's surprise at this small consideration was so evident that Julian felt shame curl hot in his stomach, felt the first whisper of doubt asking what kind of thief would sacrifice her own health so completely for the sister of the man who had destroyed her. What kind of villain would research treatments with such devotion? What kind of guilty woman would return at all when she had every reason to let them all suffer as she had suffered? And though he said nothing of these thoughts aloud, they planted themselves in his mind like seeds that would grow in darkness, sending roots down through the certainty he had worn like armor for 6 long months. Weeks passed like water flowing over stone, slow and steady and transforming, and Caroline's improvement became the axis around which life at Ravencroft Manor turned, her fever breaking at last into restful sleep, her appetite returning in small increments, her laughter beginning to echo faintly through the halls that had been so silent with worry and grief. Helena remained at her bedside through it all, coaxing spoonfuls of broth past pale lips, reading aloud until her voice grew hoarse, adjusting pillows and blankets with infinite patience, and Julian found himself watching this devotion with growing unease, for no matter how he tried to reconcile Helena's tireless care with the image of a thief and deceiver, the pieces would not fit together, would not form the picture his anger had painted for 6 long months. He observed how Helena sat with Caroline through the long afternoons when the girl was strong enough to be awake but too weak still for much activity, how she told stories and played cards and braided Caroline's hair with gentle fingers, how she never once mentioned her own suffering or the injustice of her circumstances, how she gave everything and asked for nothing, and the household staff began to whisper their approval in corners where they thought he could not hear, murmuring that Lady Helena had returned like an angel of mercy, that his lordship had been wrong to cast her out, that anyone with eyes could see she was as devoted to Lady Caroline as any sister by blood could be. Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper, approached him one morning with the information that Lady Helena's rooms were inadequately heated, and her meals insufficient for someone keeping such demanding hours, and Julian heard in the older woman's tone a reproach carefully veiled but unmistakable, and he found himself ordering that fires be kept blazing in Helena's chambers at all hours, that better meals be sent to her on proper china, rather than the simple fare he had initially authorized, that her rooms be supplied with fresh flowers and the books he remembered she favored. And when Mrs. Henshaw looked at him with something like hope dawning in her weathered face, he told himself sharply that these were merely practical considerations, that Helena could hardly care for Caroline if she herself fell ill from cold or hunger, that his orders had nothing to do with the uncomfortable twist in his chest when he had seen her sitting in his mother's old shawl because her own was too threadbare to provide warmth. He told himself this even as he found his steps carrying him past Caroline's room at hours when he had no reason to be in that wing of the house, even as he lingered in doorways, watching Helena read aloud, or brush Caroline's hair, or simply sit, holding his sister's hand while the girl slept, even as he noticed the particular way candlelight caught in Helena's auburn hair, and remembered evenings when he had thought such things beautiful rather than threatening. And with each passing day, the certainty that had sustained his anger grew thinner, worn away by the accumulated weight of small kindnesses observed, by the evidence of sacrifice freely given, by the stubborn voice in his mind asking what manner of guilty woman would return to the house of her accuser and tend his sister with such devotion, what kind of thief would work herself to exhaustion for the family that had destroyed her. And though Julian pushed these questions away during the day, they returned to him in the darkness of sleepless nights, persistent and patient, and impossible to silence. Autumn arrived at Ravencroft Manor with a painter's touch, transforming the gardens into a tapestry of copper and gold, and as Caroline's strength returned in measured increments, the physician declared that gentle exercise would aid her recovery, walks in the fresh air to restore colour to her cheeks and vigour to her limbs. And so it became Helena's custom each afternoon to guide the girl through the garden paths, moving slowly among the turning leaves, while Julian watched from his study window with an attention he could not justify even to himself. He told himself he was merely ensuring his sister's safety, that his gaze following Helena's graceful figure had nothing to do with the particular way sunlight caught in her hair, or how her face softened when Caroline laughed. But the lie grew thinner each day, worn transparent by repetition, and on an afternoon when the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind carried the scent of distant wood smoke, Julian found himself abandoning his ledgers and walking down to the garden, as though his feet had made the decision without consulting his mind. He came upon them near the rose arbour, where late-season blooms still clung to their stems, and Caroline's face lit with surprised pleasure at seeing her brother, for he had kept his distance during her illness, unable to bear the weight of worry and the memories that her pale face evoked, and she called out to him with something of her old spirit returning, beckoning him to join them in their circuit of the grounds. Julian fell into step beside them, and for a moment, suspended in the golden afternoon light, with Caroline chattering happily between them about the flowers and the birds, and her plans for when she was fully recovered, it felt like old times, like the days before scandal and death and suspicion had carved chasms between them all, and Julian felt the ache of that lost ease like a wound that had never properly healed. Caroline mentioned a memory from 3 years past, a garden party their mother had hosted when Helena had helped her pick flowers for the arrangements, and she laughed at some detail of the day, and Helena smiled, truly smiled, the expression transforming her face with such radiance that Julian felt his breath catch, felt the loss of that smile like a physical ache spreading through his chest, for he remembered when such expressions had been directed at him, when Helena's laughter had rung freely in his presence, when she had looked at him with warmth, rather than the careful blankness she now maintained like armour. He realized with startling clarity that he had not seen her smile like that since her arrival, that the Helena who had returned to Ravencroft was a muted shadow of the woman he remembered, and the knowledge that he had stolen her brightness, that his cruelty had dimmed the light that once drew everyone to her, settled on him with crushing weight. And as they walked on through the gardens with Caroline's voice filling the spaces between them, Julian found himself memorizing the curve of Helena's smile, the grace of her movements, the gentle patience in her voice when she answered his sister's questions. And he thought that perhaps he had been wrong about more than just the theft. Perhaps he had been wrong about everything, and the thought terrified him, even as it took root in the fertile soil of his growing doubt, spreading tendrils that would not be denied. Caroline declared one morning at breakfast that she wished to visit the portrait gallery, that she felt strong enough now for the walk through the long corridors and wanted to see her mother's face painted in oils rather than merely remembered in dreams, and Helena agreed immediately, rising from her barely touched toast to accompany the girl, while Julian found himself setting down his newspaper and following at a careful distance, drawn by something he could not name, perhaps the note of longing in his sister's voice, or perhaps the instinct that this pilgrimage mattered in ways he did not yet understand. The gallery occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, a space their father had commissioned when Julian was still a boy, and the October light streaming through tall windows illuminated generations of Blackwoods looking down from their frames with varying degrees of severity and satisfaction, their painted eyes following the living as they passed, and Caroline moved slowly along the row of ancestors, commenting on resemblances and stories she half remembered, while Helena walked beside her with a hand hovering near the girl's elbow should she tire, and Julian trailed behind them both, watching the way Helena's expression shifted from portrait to portrait, how she paused before his grandfather with something like recognition, how she smiled slightly at the painting of Julian himself as a boy with his first pony, and when they reached the end of the gallery, where the most recent additions hung, Caroline stopped before the portrait of their mother, commissioned just a year before her death, and the sudden stillness in his sister's shoulders told Julian that grief had found her again, as it found them all in unexpected moments. Lady Margaret Blackwood looked out from her frame with gentle eyes, and the hint of a smile playing at her lips, captured by the artist in her favourite blue gown, and Helena stood beside Caroline in silence for a long moment before speaking, her voice soft with genuine emotion, as she said that Lady Margaret had been the kindest woman she had ever known, that she had made Helena feel welcomed and cherished when the whole world seemed cold after her parents' deaths, that she had taught Helena everything about grace and strength, and how to bear loss without losing oneself. And Julian heard in Helena's words a love so pure and unfeigned that something cracked in his chest, some barrier he had built against the possibility of her innocence. Caroline leaned her head against Helena's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that spoke of bonds deeper than scandal could sever, and she said with the casual thoughtlessness of youth that their mother had always claimed Helena would make a perfect addition to the family, that she had told Caroline more than once that she hoped Julian might see what was right in front of him, and that Helena would make him an excellent countess some day, and the words hung in the air like bells that could not be unrung, and Julian felt the earth shift beneath his feet, felt the weight of his mother's hopes and his own blindness pressing down upon him with crushing force. Helena's face had gone very still, very pale, and she did not look at Julian, though he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she did not acknowledge what Caroline had revealed, and his sister continued on, oblivious to the tremor her words had caused, mentioning how their mother had spoken of Helena's intelligence and kindness, and the particular light she brought to any room. And Julian stood there in the gallery, surrounded by the painted faces of his ancestors, and felt the full measure of what he had destroyed. Not just Helena's reputation, but his mother's hopes, the future that might have been if he had been less quick to judgment, less eager to believe the worst. And he understood with terrible clarity that his mother would have been ashamed of what he had done, that the woman looking down from that portrait would have demanded proof and shown mercy, and never would have crushed someone she loved on the strength of circumstantial evidence and wounded pride. And as Helena gently guided Caroline toward the next painting, speaking in careful tones about some ancestor's military career, Julian remained before his mother's portrait and felt for the first time the true weight of his guilt, not just for what he had done to Helena, but for betraying everything his mother had tried to teach him about honor and justice, and the courage required to see the truth, even when it contradicted what anger demanded he believe. That night, Julian could not sleep, could not rest, could not escape the questions that circled his mind like carrion birds waiting for certainty to die. And he rose from his bed in the dark hours before dawn and made his way to his study, where the original documents from the investigation into the theft still resided in a locked drawer, yellowed and accusatory. And he spread them across his desk with hands that trembled slightly as he began to read with new eyes no longer clouded by grief and rage, but sharpened by the terrible possibility that he had been catastrophically wrong. The evidence that had seemed so damning a year ago now revealed itself as circumstantial at best, built on the testimony of a housemaid who claimed to have seen Helena near the display room where the sapphire necklace had been kept, on the fact that Helena had been one of the last guests to leave the house party, on the discovery that she had debts her modest inheritance could not cover. But nowhere in these papers was there actual proof, no witness to the act itself, no recovery of the necklace in her possession. Nothing but suspicion and opportunity, and Julian's own willingness to believe the worst, because it gave shape to his grief over his mother's death and his rage at a world that kept taking things from him. He remembered now with sickening clarity how Helena had protested her innocence, how she had stood in this very room with tears streaming down her face and begged him to believe her, and he remembered with equal clarity how he had dismissed her pleas as the lies of a desperate thief, how he had told her that her denials only proved her guilt, how he had demanded she confess, and when she refused he had taken his revenge in whispers and insinuations that spread through London like plague, destroying her with the same thoroughness his mother's death had destroyed his faith in goodness. Julian rose from his desk and began to pace, pulling other memories from the wreckage of that terrible time, and he recalled with growing horror that Helena had never tried to deflect blame onto another person, had never suggested an alternative culprit, despite the fact that doing so might have saved her, and this struck him now as profoundly strange, because a guilty person would have grasped at any straw, would have invented a scapegoat, or pointed to someone else with access. But Helena had simply maintained her innocence while refusing to speculate about who might truly be responsible. And why would she do that, unless she knew the real thief and was protecting them? And if she was protecting someone, then the most likely person for her to shield would be someone she loved, someone whose future she valued more than her own reputation. Someone like Caroline, who had been 16 at the time and already showing signs of the reckless romanticism that had nearly destroyed her this past year. The thought settled into Julian's chest like a stone dropped into deep water, sinking and sinking until it touched bottom, and he sat down heavily in his chair and put his head in his hands. And he thought of how Caroline had fallen ill, not from any physical malady, but from heartbreak over some scoundrel. How she had called for Helena in her delirium, how she had wept with what seemed like guilt as much as joy when Helena arrived, and the pieces began to arrange themselves into a picture Julian did not want to see, but could no longer deny. A picture in which his sister had taken the necklace perhaps to give to some fortune hunter who promised marriage, in which Helena had discovered the theft and chosen to shoulder the blame rather than destroy a girl she loved like a sister, in which Julian himself had played the role of executioner for an innocent woman, while the truly guilty party recovered in comfort under his own roof, and the weight of this possibility, this probability, this near certainty, crushed down upon him with such force that he could scarcely breathe, and he knew with terrible conviction that he needed to discover the truth, even if that truth destroyed him, even if it meant facing the magnitude of his own cruelty, and the irreparable harm he had inflicted on someone who deserved only his protection and his gratitude. And as the first grey light of dawn began to filter through his study windows, Julian made a silent vow to uncover what had really happened that night, to follow every thread no matter where it led, to face whatever truths emerged, even if they proved him to be not the avenging son he had imagined himself, but rather the instrument of injustice, the destroyer of innocence, the villain in a story where he had cast himself as hero. The fever returned 3 nights later without warning, seizing Caroline in the small hours when darkness pressed against the windows, and the house lay silent, save for the ticking of clocks marking time's relentless passage, and Helena woke to the sound of Caroline's maid pounding on her door with panic in her voice, and within moments she was in Caroline's room, where the girl thrashed against her sheets, with skin burning hot to the touch, and words tumbling from her lips in a torrent of delirium, and Helena sent for cold compresses and laudanum, and Julian, who arrived in his shirt-sleeves with hair dishevelled and fear stark in his eyes, and together they worked through those dark hours to bring the fever down, to keep Caroline from harming herself in her agitation, to whisper reassurances that could not penetrate the veil of sickness that had descended over her mind. Julian held his sister's shoulders, while Helena pressed cool cloths to her forehead and throat, while the physician was summoned from the village, and the household stirred with worried whispers, and Caroline's fever-bright eyes stared at nothing, as words spilled from her without coherence or restraint, fragments of memory and guilt surfacing from whatever depths fever had unlocked. And at first her mumblings made no sense, disjointed phrases about promises and pretty words, and how she had been such a fool. But then, through the confusion came words that made Julian go absolutely still, made his hands tighten on his sister's shoulders, as Caroline cried out that she was sorry, so sorry for taking the necklace, that she had only meant to give it to him because he said they would marry, that he had promised her everything if she could bring him something of value. And Helena tried to quiet the girl, tried to soothe her back toward sleep, but Caroline would not be silenced, and she wept with the abandon of fever and regret as she said that Helena had found her in the display room with the sapphire necklace in her hands, that Helena had understood immediately what Caroline had done and why, and the girl's voice broke as she remembered how Helena had taken the necklace from her trembling fingers and told her to go back to bed, to forget this ever happened, that everything would be all right. Julian's face had gone white as marble in the lamplight, and he looked across Caroline's restless form to where Helena knelt on the opposite side of the bed, and their eyes met over the sister who lay between them, confessing sins neither of them had wanted confirmed. And Caroline continued in her delirium to speak of how she had hidden in her room the next morning when the theft was discovered, how she had listened to the accusations against Helena with mounting horror, how Helena had come to her privately afterward and made her swear never to speak of what had really happened, to let the world believe whatever it would believe, but to protect herself and her future. And the girl sobbed that she had been too young and too frightened and too grateful to refuse, that she had let Helena sacrifice everything while she remained safe and quiet and ashamed, and Julian felt the last foundations of his certainty crumble into dust, felt the terrible truth settle into his bones with the weight of irrevocable fact, and he understood with devastating clarity that he had destroyed an innocent woman, that Helena had chosen ruin and exile and loneliness rather than expose a girl she loved to the consequences of youthful foolishness and misplaced trust in a scoundrel's promises, and the magnitude of his crime against her, the unforgivable cruelty of his revenge visited upon someone who deserved only his gratitude and protection, crashed over him like a wave that could drown a man where he stood. And he watched Helena's face remain carefully composed, even as Caroline's confession filled the room with truths that could never be unheard. And he saw in her eyes not triumph at vindication, but only deep weariness and resignation, as though she had always known this moment would come eventually, and had long since stopped hoping it might change anything that mattered. The physician arrived near dawn, and administered laudanum, that finally brought Caroline into a deep and peaceful sleep, her breathing steady and her fever broken at last, and he assured them that the crisis had passed and she would wake restored. And then he departed with instructions for her continued care, leaving Julian and Helena alone in the dim corridor outside Caroline's room, where the first pale light of morning filtered through tall windows and cast long shadows across the Persian carpet. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with revelations that could not be ignored or dismissed. And finally Julian turned to Helena with a face ravaged by sleeplessness and the terrible weight of understanding, and said in a voice rough with emotion that they needed to speak, that he required the truth from her own lips, though he already knew what that truth must be. And Helena looked at him with eyes so tired they seemed to hold centuries of weariness, and replied that Caroline's fever had spoken plainly enough, and there was nothing more to say. But Julian shook his head and insisted with quiet desperation that he needed to hear it from her, needed to understand how she could have borne such injustice in silence. And so they went to the library, where a fire still burned low in the grate, and the smell of old leather and paper surrounded them like the ghosts of better times. And Julian stood before the fireplace with his hands clenched at his sides, while Helena sat in a chair near the window and watched dawn break over the gardens where they had once walked as friends. And he asked her directly whether Caroline had stolen the necklace, whether Helena had discovered her and chosen to accept blame rather than expose the girl. And Helena sat silent for so long that Julian thought she might refuse to answer. But then she spoke in a voice devoid of emotion and confirmed everything Caroline's delirium had revealed, explained how she had found the girl in the display room with the sapphire necklace clutched in trembling hands and tears streaming down her face, how Caroline had confessed through sobs that a gentleman had promised to marry her if she could bring him something of value, how Helena had understood immediately that the girl had been deceived by a fortune hunter who would abandon her the moment he possessed the necklace, and how she had taken the jewelry from Caroline's hands and told her to return to bed and speak of this to no one, had made the decision in that moment to protect a girl she loved like a sister, even if it meant sacrificing her own standing in society. And Julian listened with horror mounting in his chest as Helena described with terrible composure how she had hidden the necklace in her own rooms, intending to return it quietly the next day and claim she had found it misplaced. But the theft had been discovered before she could act, and suspicion had fallen upon her immediately. And she had seen in that moment that she could either tell the truth and destroy Caroline's future, or remain silent and weather whatever storm came, and she had chosen silence, had chosen love over self-preservation, had accepted exile and shame and loneliness rather than speak words that would ruin a girl of 16 who had committed one foolish mistake born of romantic delusion and youthful naivety. And as Helena's voice finally fell silent, Julian found he could not speak, could not form words adequate to the enormity of what she had sacrificed, and he sank into the chair opposite hers and put his face in his hands, and the guilt that consumed him was a living thing with teeth and claws that tore at his conscience, for he understood now with devastating clarity that he had destroyed an innocent woman, that his need for vengeance had blinded him to truth and justice, that Helena had deserved his protection and gratitude, but had received instead his cruelty and his calculated destruction of her reputation. And when he finally looked up at her with eyes wet with unshed tears and horror at himself, he found her watching him with an expression of such quiet dignity in the face of his anguish that it cut him more deeply than any accusation could have done. And he knew in that moment that no apology could ever be sufficient, no penance could ever balance the scales of what he had done to her, but he also knew he would spend whatever remained of his life trying. Julian's apology began in the grey light of morning, as they sat in that library where books lined the walls like silent witnesses to confessions and revelations, and he spoke words that felt like ashes in his mouth, inadequate and small against the enormity of what he had done to her, and he told Helena with a voice breaking under the weight of his guilt that he was sorry, that those words held no power to undo the damage he had inflicted upon her life and her name and her peace, but that he spoke them nonetheless because they were all he had to offer in that moment. And he watched her face remain eerily still as he catalogued his crimes against her, how he had spread the scandal with calculated precision through London's drawing rooms, how he had ensured that every hostess knew of her supposed theft, how he had wielded his influence like a weapon to destroy her standing in society, how he had taken satisfaction in watching her become a pariah, an outcast, a cautionary tale whispered about at balls she would no longer be invited to attend. And Helena listened with eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him, hollow and dark with exhaustion and something deeper than fatigue, something that looked like the death of hope. And when he finally fell silent, she said in a voice devoid of inflection, that apologies changed nothing, that her life was already destroyed and no words could restore what had been taken from her, and Julian felt that truth like a blade between his ribs, because he knew she was right, knew that sorry was a pittance offered to someone from whom he had stolen everything. But still he pressed forward with desperate need and begged for the chance to make amends, to spend whatever time remained to him trying to repair even a fraction of the devastation he had wrought. And Helena regarded him for a long moment before speaking again, and what she said surprised him, because she asked not for restitution or revenge, but only that he keep the truth from Caroline, that he allow his sister to believe the story they would construct about new evidence exonerating Helena, about some other culprit discovered and the whole matter resolved without Caroline's name ever being mentioned. And she explained with quiet insistence that Caroline must never know she had confessed during her fever, must never carry the burden of understanding that her moment of foolishness had cost someone she loved so dearly, that the girl deserved to move forward into her future, unburdened by guilt and shame. And Julian understood in that request the depth of Helena's love for his sister, understood that even now, even after everything, she thought first of protecting Caroline, rather than claiming vindication or demanding that the truth be known, and he promised with solemn oath that Caroline would never learn what her delirium had revealed, that they would craft whatever fiction was necessary to preserve her innocence and her peace of mind. And Helena nodded once in acknowledgment before rising from her chair and moving toward the door as though the conversation was finished, as though his apologies and promises were simply matters to be noted and filed away and forgotten. And Julian called after her that he would find a way to restore her reputation, that he would devote himself to repairing what he had broken. But she paused only briefly in the doorway and said without turning back that some things once shattered could never be made whole again, that he should not trouble himself with impossible tasks. And then she was gone, leaving him alone in the library with the morning light growing stronger through the windows, and the terrible understanding that her forgiveness, if it ever came, would be neither quick nor easy, and that he deserved nothing less than the long and painful road ahead. Julian departed for London within 3 days of their conversation in the library, leaving Helena at Ravenscroft Manor with Caroline, who had indeed recovered beautifully, and believed the carefully constructed fiction that new evidence had come to light, exonerating Helena completely. And while his sister chattered happily about Helena's restored innocence and how wonderful it was that the truth had finally emerged, Julian travelled to town with a determination forged in the fire of his guilt, and set about the methodical work of undoing the damage he had so deliberately inflicted upon Helena's name. And he began by calling upon Lord Ashworth, one of society's most influential gossips, and telling him in confidence a story he had rehearsed until it sounded entirely plausible about how his investigators had finally discovered the true culprit, a dismissed servant named Thomas Wardley, who had fled to America with several stolen items, including the sapphire necklace, and who had cleverly arranged for suspicion to fall upon Lady Helena through planted evidence and manipulated circumstances. And Lord Ashworth had listened with wide eyes, and declared it a terrible miscarriage of justice, and promised to spread the truth immediately, which Julian knew he would do with the same enthusiasm he had once spread the lies. And from there Julian moved through London's drawing rooms like a man possessed, attending gatherings he would normally have avoided, seeking out the very people who had whispered about Helena's disgrace. And at each gathering he told his story with just the right mixture of outrage at the deception and remorse for having believed it. And he watched as the narrative shifted before his eyes, as the same people who had condemned Helena now expressed sympathy for her ordeal and satisfaction that the real thief had been identified. Though Julian noticed with bitter irony how easily they forgave themselves for their prior judgment, how quickly they embraced this new version of events without acknowledging their own role in her suffering, and he attended the opera and made certain to mention within hearing of the Duchess of Marlborough that he hoped Lady Helena would return to society soon, now that her name was cleared. And he wrote letters to every hostess of note explaining the situation and expressing his family's deepest regrets that an innocent woman had suffered due to the actions of a criminal servant, and he used every ounce of his considerable influence to shift the tide of opinion, calling in favours and applying pressure where necessary. And slowly, methodically, he rebuilt what he had destroyed, though he knew even as he did so that Helena was right, that some damage went too deep for society's fickleness to truly heal, that she would forever carry the scars of what had been done to her, regardless of how many people now claimed to have never really believed the accusations. And when he returned to Ravenscroft Manor 6 weeks later, having done everything within his power to restore her standing, he found Helena in the music room playing the pianoforte for Caroline, and she looked up as he entered and regarded him with those same hollow eyes that showed neither gratitude nor hope. And he understood in that moment that all his efforts in London, all his careful manipulation of society's opinion, had been for his own conscience rather than for her benefit, because Helena had already accepted that her old life was gone, and no amount of strategic gossip could return to her what she had lost, which was not merely her reputation, but her faith in the world and the people who inhabited it. And Julian felt the weight of that understanding settle upon him like a shroud as he stood in the doorway and watched her return her attention to the music, her fingers moving across the keys with mechanical precision, playing notes that held no joy because he had stolen that from her too. Spring arrived at Ravenscroft Manor with a tentative warmth that seemed to mirror the fragile peace settling over its inhabitants, and as Caroline bloomed with renewed health and the gardens burst into colour after the long winter, Helena began making quiet preparations to depart, packing her few belongings and making arrangements for modest lodgings in Bath, where she might live on the small income Julian's campaign had secured for her through carefully orchestrated settlements that appeared to be restitution from the fictitious servant's family. And she told herself it was time to leave this place where she had experienced both profound happiness and devastating loss. Time to build whatever life remained to her away from memories that cut like glass. But Caroline discovered her packing one afternoon and burst into tears, begging Helena not to leave, saying she could not bear to lose her again when they had only just been reunited, and the girl clutched at Helena's hands with desperate affection and pleaded that Ravenscroft Manor was her home, that she belonged here with them. And Helena tried gently to explain that she had imposed upon their hospitality long enough, that it was improper for her to remain now that Caroline was well. But Caroline would not be consoled, and ran to find Julian, and he came to Helena's rooms that evening, and stood in the doorway, with an expression she could not quite read, and said in a voice carefully stripped of demand that he would be grateful if she would consider staying, that the manor felt more like a home with her in it, that Caroline needed her still, and Helena heard what he did not say, heard the unspoken plea beneath his formal words, and she found herself agreeing, though she could not have explained why, could not have articulated the force that kept her tethered to this place and these people despite everything. And so the weeks stretched into months, and Helena remained at Ravenscroft Manor in a position that defied easy definition, neither guest nor family nor servant, simply present. And Julian began a careful courtship of her approval that was so subtle she almost did not notice it at first. Books appearing in the window seat where she liked to read on sunny mornings, volumes of poetry she had once mentioned loving, flowers from the greenhouse arranged in her rooms. Not the showy hothouse roses that society favoured, but the simpler blooms she preferred, daffodils and jasmine and sweet peas. And he sought her out for conversations that had nothing to do with Caroline or household matters, asking her opinion on estate business, on whether the tenant cottages needed repair, on what crops might be planted in the south fields, treating her thoughts as valuable rather than dismissible. And he listened when she spoke, truly listened with his full attention rather than the polite pretense of interest. And Helena recognized these gestures for what they were, small offerings laid at her feet like tributes, attempts to prove through accumulated kindnesses that he was not the man who had destroyed her, and she accepted them with cautious acknowledgement. Unwilling to trust, but unable to entirely dismiss the effort, and she felt her heart begin to thaw, despite her desperate attempts to keep it frozen in protective ice, felt dangerous warmth creeping through the numbness she had cultivated, and she told herself she was a fool to soften toward him, that his guilt-driven kindness changed nothing about what he had done. But still she found herself looking for him when she entered a room, found herself listening for his footsteps in the hall, found herself noticing the way lamplight caught in his dark hair and the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of his own sleepless nights, and she guarded her heart with fierce determination, even as she felt its walls beginning to crack. The winter storm arrived without warning on a December afternoon when the sky had been deceptively clear, and within hours Ravencroft Manor was engulfed in a howling tempest that rattled the ancient windows and piled snow against the doors until the household was entirely cut off from the outside world, and Caroline retired early, with a headache, leaving Helena and Julian alone in the drawing-room, where a fire blazed against the cold, and the wind shrieked like something alive and furious, and they sat in chairs angled toward the hearth, with the awkwardness of two people who had become accustomed to Caroline's presence as a buffer between them, and the silence stretched until Julian spoke suddenly about his mother, how she had died in a room upstairs during just such a storm, how he had been barely 21 and unprepared for the weight of the title and the estate and the responsibility for Caroline, who was only 14 and still a child. And Helena listened as he spoke of his father, who had been cold and distant even before his wife's death, and who had withdrawn entirely afterward, leaving Julian to navigate grief and duty alone. And he spoke of how the estate had been failing, debts his father had hidden coming to light, tenants suffering, the family name tarnished by mismanagement, and how he had worked himself nearly to death restoring it all while watching Caroline grieve, and knowing he could not comfort her because he was drowning in his own sorrow. And his voice grew raw as he confessed that when the necklace disappeared and suspicion fell on Helena, he had seized upon it with terrible relief, because finally here was something he could control, someone he could punish for all the powerlessness he felt. And destroying her reputation had been the only time since his mother's death that he had felt capable of affecting the world around him rather than being crushed beneath its weight. And he looked at Helena then, with eyes that held nothing but anguish, and said he knew it was no excuse, that his grief did not justify what he had done to her, but he wanted her to understand that his cruelty had been born not from strength, but from the most abject weakness, from a broken boy hiding inside an earl's title, desperately trying to feel anything other than helpless. And Helena felt something shift inside her chest as she watched this proud man strip himself bare before her, and she saw beneath the facade of the cold Earl, who had destroyed her life to the wounded child, who had been given burdens too heavy to bear, and who had lashed out in his pain, and she understood in that moment that Julian had been as much a victim of circumstance as she had been, that they had both been broken by forces beyond their control and had hurt each other from their respective wounds, and while understanding did not erase what he had done or heal the damage inflicted, it created space for something other than pure resentment to exist, and she found herself speaking softly about forgiveness, not offering it yet, but acknowledging its possibility, and Julian's expression transformed with such desperate hope that she had to look away. And they sat together as the storm raged outside, and something like peace settled between them, fragile as new ice, but real nonetheless. The days following the storm carried a changed quality, as though the tempest had cleared more than just the winter sky, and Helena found herself seeking Julian's company in ways she had not allowed herself before. And one evening, when Caroline had retired early, they sat together in the library, and Helena began to speak of things she had never voiced aloud, her voice soft and halting as she described the particular loneliness of orphanhood, how losing her parents at 15 had left her adrift in a world that suddenly had no anchor, and she spoke of being passed between relatives who took her in from duty rather than love, always conscious that she was a burden, always careful to make herself small and unobtrusive and grateful. And she confessed that when Julian's mother had welcomed her into their home, it was the first time since her parents' death that she had felt truly wanted, truly seen as something more than an obligation. And Caroline had been like the sister she never had, and this manor had become the home she thought she had lost forever. And when the scandal broke and Julian turned against her, it was not merely her reputation that shattered, but the only family she had managed to build from the ruins of her first loss. And she had been cast out once more into that terrible isolation, that sense of being unwanted and unworthy and utterly alone in the world. And her voice broke as she admitted that the worst part was not society's condemnation, but losing the people she loved, being excised from the only place she had belonged. And Julian listened with an expression of such profound anguish that she nearly stopped speaking. But something in his attention, in the way he leaned toward her as though her words were precious, encouraged her to continue. And she told him about the months after her exile, living in a dingy boarding house where the landlady looked at her with suspicion, and the other residents whispered, about the suffocating shame that followed her everywhere, about lying awake at night wondering if she should have let Caroline face the consequences instead, wondering if her sacrifice had been foolish rather than noble. And Julian reached across the space between them and took her hand, his fingers warm and solid around hers, and he said with fierce conviction that her sacrifice had been the bravest thing he had ever witnessed, that she had saved Caroline's entire future at the cost of her own, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of such selflessness, even though he knew he never could be. And Helena felt tears slip down her cheeks, the first she had allowed herself to shed in his presence, and Julian's thumb brushed them away with infinite gentleness, and she did not pull back from his touch, and they sat there with their hands joined while the fire burned low and the house settled into night around them. And Helena felt the tight knot of pain in her chest begin to loosen, felt the walls she had built around her heart develop new cracks. And when Julian finally walked her to her chambers, he lingered at her door and touched her cheek with reverent fingers, and she leaned into his palm for just a moment before stepping back, and the look that passed between them held recognition of something fragile and new, taking root, a tentative friendship being rebuilt on foundations of honesty and shared wounds. And Helena went to bed that night feeling something she had thought lost forever, feeling that perhaps she was not quite so alone in the world after all. Spring arrived at Ravencroft Manor with an almost defiant beauty, as though nature itself sought to contradict the long, dark winter that had preceded it, and the gardens exploded into bloom with daffodils carpeting the lawns and cherry blossoms drifting like snow through air that smelled of earth and renewal. And Julian watched Helena walk among the flowers one morning, and felt his heart constrict with the terrible recognition of what had been growing inside him all these months, the realization crashing over him with the force of revelation that what he felt was no longer merely remorse or even friendship, but something far more consuming and dangerous. And he understood with crystalline clarity that he loved her, had perhaps always loved her, even when he thought he hated her, and the knowledge terrified him because he had no right to such feelings, no claim to her heart after what he had done. Yet the emotion persisted with relentless intensity, refusing to be denied or diminished, and he spent sleepless nights wrestling with whether to speak or remain silent, whether confession would be selfish or necessary, until one evening when they sat together in the drawing room, and Caroline had gone to bed early, and the words simply escaped him unbidden, and he knelt before Helena's chair like a supplicant, and took her hands in his trembling ones, and told her that he loved her, that she had become the very centre of his world, that every kindness she showed Caroline and every moment of grace she extended to him, despite his unworthiness, made him love her more desperately, and he asked her to marry him, not because it would restore her reputation fully, or because duty demanded it, but because he wanted to spend every remaining day of his life trying to deserve her, trying to build something beautiful from the ashes of what he had destroyed. And he promised her everything he had and everything he was, his title and his fortune and his devotion, offering it all with shaking hands and a voice raw with emotion. And Helena stared at him with wide eyes that held shock and fear and something that might have been longing. And she pulled her hands from his and stood and moved away from him, and when she finally spoke her voice was barely a whisper as she said she could not, that she was terrified to trust him with her heart when he had already shattered it once, that she did not know if she could survive being broken again, and the refusal cut through Julian like a blade, even as he recognized its justice, and he rose slowly and told her with as much steadiness as he could manage that he understood, that he accepted her answer and would not press her, but that his feelings would not change regardless of her decision, and he promised to wait for as long as she needed, to prove himself worthy, even if she never felt able to accept him, to love her without expectation of reciprocation, because she deserved to be loved exactly that way, freely and without condition. And he saw tears slip down her cheeks, and wanted desperately to comfort her, but knew he had lost that right. So he simply bowed and left her there among the dying embers of the fire, and he went to his chambers and sat in darkness, feeling his heart break with the knowledge that he had finally found the woman he was meant to love, and had destroyed any possibility of her loving him in return. Yet even in his grief he felt a strange peace, because at least he had been honest. At least she knew the truth of his heart, and he resolved that he would spend however long it took showing her through actions rather than words that his love was real and constant and patient, that he would wait for her, even if waiting was all he would ever have. The weeks that followed Julian's declaration stretched into a strange new season of waiting, and Helena watched with cautious wonder as he made good on his promise to love her without expectation, observed as he went about his days with a quiet contentment that seemed to emanate not from hope of reciprocation, but from the simple fact of having spoken his truth. And she noticed the small ways he continued to show his care through thoughtful gestures that asked nothing in return, books appearing on her nightstand that addressed subjects they had discussed, her favourite tea served without her having to request it, his consistent respect for the boundaries she had drawn even as his eyes followed her with undisguised devotion whenever she entered a room. And something began to shift within her as she recognized that this was not the performance of a man seeking to manipulate or the desperate bargaining of someone trying to earn forgiveness, but rather the authentic expression of a transformed heart. And she found herself lying awake at night examining her own feelings with newfound honesty, acknowledging that beneath the protective layers of fear and old hurt there existed something tender and persistent, a warmth that bloomed in her chest when Julian smiled at something Caroline said, or when he looked at Helena with those storm-grey eyes full of patient adoration, and she realized with startling clarity that she loved him, had perhaps loved him even in those early days before the scandal when they were simply friends, and she had cherished his rare laughter and the intelligence that sparked in their conversations, and the recognition terrified her, until one morning in late spring, when she walked in the garden where daffodils had given way to roses, and she stood among the blooms, remembering how they had walked here as friends, and later as wary allies, and finally as two wounded souls, learning to trust again. And she understood that she had already survived the worst that could happen between them, and had emerged stronger for it, that the man who had destroyed her in his grief was not the same man who now loved her with such humble constancy, and she made her decision in that moment among the roses with their heavy perfume and morning dew still glistening on the petals. And when Julian came upon her there, as he often did on his morning walks, she turned to him and saw the careful way he maintained his distance, respecting her unspoken boundaries, and something in her heart broke open, and she closed the space between them and took his hands in hers, and said with a voice that trembled only slightly that she had been afraid for so long, afraid to trust and afraid to hope, and most of all, afraid to love. But she was tired of letting fear dictate her choices, and she told him that she loved him too, had loved him perhaps all along beneath the hurt, and she said yes to his proposal with tears streaming down her face, and Julian stared at her as though she had offered him salvation itself, and he cupped her face in his hands with infinite tenderness and asked if she was certain, giving her every opportunity to reconsider, and she answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of morning and roses and new beginnings, and they stood there wrapped in each other's arms while the garden bloomed around them in riotous celebration of spring. And when they finally returned to the house, hand in hand, they found Caroline in the morning room, and she took one look at their joined hands and their radiant faces, and burst into tears of pure joy, and she embraced them both, and declared it the happiest day of her life, to see the two people she loved most in the world finally finding their way to each other. And the household staff heard the news and gathered to offer congratulations with genuine warmth. And in the following weeks, they planned a quiet wedding in the estate chapel, with only Caroline and a few close friends in attendance. And on a June morning thick with the scent of summer flowers, Helena walked down the aisle in a simple gown of ivory silk, and met Julian's eyes at the altar, and saw in them wonder and gratitude and unwavering love. And they spoke their vows with voices steady and sure, promising to cherish and protect each other through whatever trials might come. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Julian kissed her with reverent joy, and they began their married life together, not with the naive optimism of youth, but with the hard-won wisdom of two people who had journeyed through darkness and chosen to build something luminous from the ashes of their shared pain. 5 years passed like a gentle dream, and Ravenscroft Manor transformed under Helena's tender influence into something it had never been, even in the days before grief had darkened its halls. And now the ancient stones echoed with laughter and light, with the sound of small feet racing through corridors that had once known only solemn silence. And on a golden afternoon in late summer, Helena stood at the nursery window, watching her children play in the gardens below. 3-year-old Robert chasing his younger sister Margaret through the roses, while their nursemaid followed at a careful distance, and she felt Julian's arms encircle her waist from behind, and leaned back into his embrace with the unconscious ease of deep contentment, and he pressed a kiss to her temple, and murmured that he still could not quite believe this happiness was real, that some mornings he woke in terror, that it had all been a beautiful dream, and he would find himself alone again in the cold emptiness of his own making. And she turned in his arms and touched his face with infinite tenderness, and told him, as she had told him countless times before, that this was real, that they were real, that the life they had built together from ashes and forgiveness was as solid as the ancient manor around them. And through the open window drifted the sound of Caroline's voice calling to the children, for she lived with them still, now 23, and engaged to a gentle country vicar who loved her for her kindness rather than her fortune. And Helena had become not just sister to her, but saviour and friend, the keeper of secrets that would remain forever unspoken. And Helena's reputation had been gradually restored through Julian's tireless efforts and her own quiet dignity, through the charity work she had undertaken, helping other women who had suffered scandal and loss, offering them shelter and support, and the wisdom of one who had walked through fire and emerged refined rather than destroyed. And society had eventually embraced her again, though she cared little for their approval now. having learned that true worth was measured not in ballroom invitations, but in the love of those who knew her fully and cherished her anyway. And Julian watched his wife move through their life together with endless wonder and gratitude, knowing with crystalline clarity how close he had come to destroying the very happiness he now held. And late at night, when the house was quiet and they lay together in the darkness, he would sometimes confess his lingering guilt, and she would silence him with kisses and remind him that they had both been transformed by their journey, that the people they had become through suffering and forgiveness were stronger and wiser than the people they might have been without it, and they had built something rare and precious from the ruins of his cruelty and her sacrifice, a love that was tested and true and tempered by fire. Dear listener, perhaps you have heard in this tale an echo of your own struggles, your own mistakes, or the wounds others have inflicted upon you, and if so, know that transformation is always possible, even from the darkest places, that patience and genuine remorse can bridge chasms that seem impossibly wide, and that healing comes not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small daily choices to be better, to love more authentically, to extend grace even when it feels undeserved. We are all of us capable of terrible wrongs when we act from pain and fear, and we are all of us capable of extraordinary courage when we choose vulnerability over pride, truth over comfort, forgiveness over the bitter satisfaction of holding grudges that poison only ourselves. Judge slowly, for you cannot know what burdens another carries, or what hidden sacrifices they have made for love. Look beneath surfaces, for the deepest waters run quiet, and the most profound transformations happen in silence. Believe in redemption, for even the worst mistakes can become the foundation of wisdom if we have the courage to face what we have done and spend our lives making amends. May you find the strength to forgive those who have wounded you, and may you extend to yourself the same grace when you inevitably fall short of who you wish to be. May your nights be peaceful, and your days be filled with the kind of love that grows deeper with time, the love that is earned and chosen and renewed each morning with intention and devotion. May you rest well, dear listener, and may your own story find its way toward healing and light. This has been a Regency Reverie production, and if this tale has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share these stories with others who might find comfort in knowing that even the most broken things can be made beautiful again.